Welcome to True Crime Chronicles Unveiled, where we dive deep into the most shocking and perplexing crimes. Today, we uncover the tragic and complex story of Jacob Porter, a beloved high school teacher whose seemingly perfect life in a quiet Texas town concealed dark secrets. What started as an ordinary day led to a brutal murder, unraveling a web of hidden tensions and betrayals. In the small town of Cave, just outside Austin, Texas, Jacob Porter was known as a dedicated high school teacher, a devoted father, and a reliable member of the community. At 32 years old, he lived a life that, from the outside, seemed perfect. He was married to Anna, a beautiful woman he met shortly after finishing his degree in education at the University of Texas at Austin. Together, they had a young child, a 4-year-old son named Eli. They lived in a well-kept suburban home, a short drive from Lake Travis, where families often gathered for picnics and boat trips. Jacob's in-laws, Richard and Linda Parker, were highly respected in Cave. Richard, Anna's father, was a powerful businessman who had made his fortune through real estate development across the Austin area. He was well-connected, charming, and always knew how to put people at ease, which made him a pillar of the local social scene. Linda Parker, Richard's wife, was equally admired. She chaired local charity events, was a member of various boards, and was seen as a graceful, nurturing figure, loved by everyone who crossed her path. Despite his seemingly happy marriage, Jacob had always felt uneasy around his father-in-law. Richard had a commanding presence that overshadowed everything, and Jacob often felt small in comparison. Richard could make anyone feel insignificant without saying a word, just a look or gesture was enough. Their relationship had always been complicated, but no one ever suspected how deep the tension ran beneath the surface. It was a warm spring morning on April 3, 2017, when a jogger running along the shoreline of Lake Travis noticed something unusual. Lying at the edge of the lake was a body, motionless, partly in the water, and surrounded by a small pool of blood. The jogger, startled and frightened, quickly called 911, reporting what looked like a possible accident. By the time the authorities arrived, it became clear that this was no accidental drowning. Jacob Porter, the beloved high school teacher, was dead, his shirt soaked in blood, with a single deep stab wound in his chest. The initial assumption was that he may have been attacked or involved in some kind of struggle, but no one knew for sure what had happened. The serene shores of Lake Travis had become the scene of a brutal crime, and the community of Cave was about to be shaken to its core. Detective Michael Harper, a seasoned investigator with the Austin Police Department, was called in to lead the investigation. Harper had seen his share of homicides, but something about this case felt different. A well-respected man with no known enemies found dead by the lake. It didn't add up. Harper made his way to the scene, his eyes scanning the surroundings, already forming theories in his head. The jogger who had found the body stood nearby, still visibly shaken, as crime scene investigators began their work. Harper knew that cases like this were rarely what they seemed on the surface. The investigation began with interviews. First, Harper spoke with Anna, Jacob's wife. She was devastated, her face pale and drawn, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. She described her husband as a loving man, a dedicated father who would never abandon his family. She insisted that Jacob had no enemies, no reason to fear for his life. But Harper noticed something in her voice, a tremor that suggested more than just grief. There was fear. Anna seemed to be hiding something, though what it was, Harper couldn't yet tell. Next, Harper turned his attention to Richard Parker, Jacob's father-in-law. Richard was composed, his expression stoic as he answered the detective's questions. He spoke about Jacob in glowing terms, describing him as a good husband and a loving father. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the way Richard spoke, something cold, detached. Harper noted it but kept his suspicions to himself. Richard was a powerful man in the community, the type who knew how to keep his emotions in check. If there was anything more to their relationship, Harper would need more than just a gut feeling to go on. Linda, Richard's wife, was present during the interviews, but she remained mostly in the background. Harper asked her a few questions, but she appeared too grief-stricken to provide much useful information. She nodded and agreed with her husband's statements, quietly weeping as the details of Jacob's death were discussed. As Harper left the Porter home that afternoon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Jacob's death was too sudden, too violent, for someone with no known enemies. The interviews with Anna and Richard had revealed little, but their body language, Anna's nervousness and Richard's cold detachment, made him uneasy. He would need to dig deeper into the lives of these people. Harper's first step was to retrieve Jacob's phone records, emails, and any personal messages that might reveal something about his relationships. As he reviewed the call logs and texts, he noticed something strange. Jacob had been in frequent contact with Richard, his father-in-law, in the days leading up to his death. At first glance, the texts seemed innocuous, discussions about family gatherings, real estate projects Richard was working on, but the frequency and the timing of the messages stood out. Why had they been communicating so often, and why had Jacob seemed tense in his recent conversations with others? The police also began to comb through surveillance footage from cameras near Lake Travis, trying to find any clue that might reveal Jacob's final movements. Harper knew that someone must have seen something, a parked car, a person walking nearby, but so far, no one had come forward. The community, shocked by the news of Jacob's death, was abuzz with rumors. Some whispered that Anna and Jacob's marriage had been strained in recent months, while others speculated that Richard had something to do with it. But no one had any concrete evidence, and for now, the case remained wide open. As Harper drove away from the scene that evening, he thought about Jacob's life, his career, his marriage, his connection to the Parker family. Something was off, but he couldn't yet put his finger on it. What Harper did know was that this wasn't just a simple case of a man attacked by a stranger. Someone close to Jacob had wanted him dead. The question was, who? Detective Michael Harper sat in his office at the Austin Police Department, sifting through the initial reports on Jacob Porter's murder. The scene by Lake Travis had left too many unanswered questions, and the interviews with Jacob's family hadn't provided much clarity. Harper knew there was something deeper, something the family wasn't saying. His instincts told him the key to unlocking the mystery lay within the dynamics of Jacob's marriage to Anna and the influence of her father, Richard. It was April 5, 2017, 2 days after Jacob's body had been found. Harper decided to focus on the tension between Jacob and Anna, hoping to uncover something that could explain why Jacob had been killed in such a violent way. He started by interviewing Anna's closest friends, beginning with Mia Carter, her best friend since their college days at the University of Texas at Austin. They had been inseparable since their freshman year, and if anyone knew about the inner workings of Anna and Jacob's marriage, it would be Mia. Mia sat across from Harper, her eyes swollen from crying. She described how the last few months had been difficult for Anna. Jacob had become distant, spending more time away from home and avoiding conversations about their future. Mia mentioned that Anna had tried to talk to Jacob several times, but he always brushed her off with excuses about work or stress. There was something deeper, Mia said, something that Anna couldn't quite put her finger on. Anna confided in me that Jacob was spending an unusual amount of time with her father, Mia told Harper. It was strange because Jacob and Richard were never close. But lately, they were going on business trips together, meeting for lunches. Anna thought it was just her father trying to help Jacob with some real estate investments, but it was all so sudden. Harper listened carefully, noting the tension in Mia's voice. He could tell she was holding something back, unsure if she should say more. Mia didn't suspect anything inappropriate but noted Jacob's unusual behavior. She thought maybe Jacob was trying to impress her father, Richard, who was a powerful man in town. Harper thanked Mia for her time, his mind already racing. The mention of Jacob's sudden closeness to Richard set off alarm bells in Harper's head. He knew he needed to dig deeper into Richard's life, and those business trips sounded like the perfect place to start. Back at the station, Harper and his team combed through Jacob's phone records. There, they found an unusual number of text messages exchanged between Jacob and Richard over the past few months. The content of the messages was unsettling. While most of them seemed to revolve around business discussions, there were several that felt oddly personal, even intimate. One particular message from Richard read, "I can't stop thinking about our time together. We need to be more careful." Harper's heart raced as he read the words. This wasn't just a business relationship. Harper's team also reviewed security footage from various locations in town, hoping to track down Jacob's final movements. Then came a breakthrough. Surveillance cameras near Lake Travis had captured a glimpse of a familiar car, Richard Parker's dark gray BMW X5. The footage showed Richard's vehicle driving past the lake just hours before Jacob's body was discovered. This new piece of evidence made Richard the prime suspect. Harper felt the pieces falling into place, but he needed more. He wanted to know where Richard had been on the day of Jacob's death, and he needed to confront him directly. With the evidence mounting, Harper drove to the Parker estate in Bee Cave, where the family had been staying since Jacob's death. The estate was an imposing sight, perched on a hill with a sweeping view of the town. As Harper walked up the long driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that the family's carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. Richard greeted him at the door, his expression a mix of politeness and barely concealed irritation. He invited Harper into the grand living room, where Linda sat quietly, staring out the window. She barely acknowledged Harper's presence, lost in her grief. Harper didn't waste time. He asked Richard about his relationship with Jacob, mentioning the frequent text messages and the business trips. Richard seemed caught off guard but quickly regained his composure. He told Harper that he had been trying to help Jacob with some real estate deals, mentoring him in the business world. He denied any inappropriate behavior, claiming that the texts were simply taken out of context. Harper's sharp questions about Richard's car and his whereabouts that morning were met with a tight-lipped response. Richard claimed he drove out to Lake Travis for a meeting with a client but didn't see Jacob. Harper didn't buy it. The tension in Richard's voice, the way his eyes darted around the room, it was all too rehearsed. But without concrete proof, Harper knew he couldn't push further just yet. He would need more evidence before he could make any arrests. As Harper left the Parker estate, he felt a growing frustration. Richard was hiding something, of that he was certain. But the investigation was far from over, and Harper knew he would have to dig deeper into Richard's life, his business dealings, and his relationship with Jacob. And then there was Linda, who remained a quiet, grieving figure in the background, seemingly uninvolved in the drama unfolding around her. The more Harper learned about the Porter and Parker families, the clearer it became that this murder wasn't just about Jacob's death. It was about power, control, and a web of secrets that had been hidden for far too long. Detective Harper stared at the grainy footage on his screen. It was security footage from the Four Seasons Hotel in Austin, recorded just a few weeks before Jacob's death. As he fast-forwarded through the video, Harper's gut tightened. There, in the corner of the frame, was Jacob, sitting across from none other than his father-in-law, Richard. They were deep in conversation, and Harper couldn't help but notice the intensity between them. This wasn't just a casual meeting. Harper had been digging through records from the hotel, tracing Jacob's and Richard's movements. Something about the way Richard had evaded questions during their last conversation told Harper there was more to the story. And now, this footage confirmed his suspicions. Jacob and Richard had been meeting at the hotel frequently. A quick call to the hotel manager confirmed even more disturbing details. Harper had asked the staff if the two men had booked rooms there, and after some back and forth, he got his answer. Jacob and Richard had been checking in under false names. The manager, uncomfortable with the request, admitted that it wasn't uncommon for high-profile guests to use pseudonyms, but this was different. The hotel records showed that they had booked adjoining rooms on multiple occasions. The nature of their relationship, Harper realized, was far more intimate than anyone had imagined. Parker leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This revelation changed everything. An affair between father-in-law and son-in-law. It was a scandal that would rock the entire community. But more importantly, it gave Richard a clear motive to kill Jacob. If their relationship had been discovered, the fallout would have been devastating for both of them. Determined to confront Anna with the truth, Harper drove out to the suburban house she had shared with Jacob, just a short drive from Lake Travis. The neighborhood was quiet, the manicured lawns and neatly trimmed hedges in stark contrast to the turmoil Anna must have been feeling inside. Harper parked in the driveway, hesitating for a moment as he took in the peaceful surroundings before knocking on the door. Anna answered, her eyes puffy and red from crying. She invited him inside, and they sat down in the living room, where the remnants of their once happy life still lingered in the air. Family photos adorned the walls, and the toys of their young child were scattered across the floor, a haunting reminder of the family Jacob had left behind. Harper explained that the investigation had uncovered evidence of a secret relationship between Jacob and her father, Richard. As he broke the news, Anna's face paled, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched a tissue. She struggled to process what Harper was telling her. She said it couldn't be true, that Jacob would never have done something like that. Harper, trying to remain gentle, told her about the hotel footage and the false names they had used to book rooms together. It was a difficult revelation, one that left Anna devastated and in disbelief. Through her sobs, Anna admitted that she had noticed Jacob acting distant in the months leading up to his death. He had been spending more time with her father, but she had assumed they were working on business deals. She never suspected that anything inappropriate was happening between them. Harper asked if she believed Richard might have killed Jacob to keep the affair a secret. Anna, visibly shaken, said she didn't know, but she acknowledged that her father was a proud man who cared deeply about his reputation. Harper nodded, knowing that Anna's suspicions mirrored his own. Richard was the type of man who would go to extreme lengths to protect his image, and if Jacob had threatened to expose the affair, it was entirely possible that Richard had taken matters into his own hands. But without concrete evidence, Harper's case was still shaky. He needed more. As the days passed, Harper continued to investigate Richard's movements on the day of Jacob's murder. The security footage from the hotel and the text messages between the two men painted a damning picture, but it wasn't enough to prove Richard's involvement in the murder. The investigation hit a frustrating dead end. Meanwhile, Linda continued to play the role of the grieving wife and mother. She seemed oblivious to the dark secrets tearing her family apart, offering her quiet support to both Richard and Anna. Harper couldn't help but wonder if she truly didn't know or if she was simply too afraid to acknowledge the truth. In an attempt to find new leads, Harper decided to revisit the scene of the crime. He walked the shores of Lake Travis, replaying everything he knew in his head. Why would Richard bring Jacob here? Was this where they had their final confrontation? Had Richard been afraid that Jacob would expose their affair to Anna or the community? But as Harper scanned the area, his mind kept returning to one crucial detail, the lack of physical evidence directly tying Richard to the crime. The hotel footage and the texts only suggested the affair, not the murder. And without concrete proof, Harper couldn't make an arrest. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting long shadows over the water, Harper felt a wave of frustration. The case was slipping away, and Richard was still walking free. He knew there was more to uncover, more secrets buried beneath the surface. But for now, the investigation was at a standstill, and the answers remained elusive. Detective Harper sat at his cluttered desk in the Austin Police Department, the case file on Jacob's murder spread open before him. Days had passed, and despite the overwhelming circumstantial evidence pointing to Richard, nothing solid had emerged to definitively link him to the crime. Richard's denials were consistent, and though his secret relationship with Jacob had been exposed, he firmly maintained he had nothing to do with Jacob's death. Harper was growing increasingly frustrated. The evidence seemed to be right in front of him, but something didn't add up. The timeline, the lack of a clear motive for murder, and the missing physical proof all gnawed at him. Despite the affair and the motive it could create, there was no forensic evidence directly tying Richard to the crime scene at Lake Travis. Yet, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something was still being overlooked. Harper spent his days re-examining everything. He had already interviewed most of Jacob's acquaintances, as well as Anna's friends, but nothing substantial had surfaced. Every lead circled back to Richard. Then, one night while reviewing the case notes, something struck him. Linda's role in the family had barely been touched on. She had been in the background the entire time, seemingly grieving quietly, supporting her husband and daughter. Harper realized that his investigation had mostly dismissed her as a figure in mourning. But there was something off. Harper started reaching out to people who knew the family socially, family friends, people from the charity circuits where Linda had been a fixture. What Harper learned surprised him. Behind her carefully composed exterior, Linda had never liked Jacob. She had made it no secret to close friends that she didn't approve of him for her daughter. Some even described Linda as resentful of Jacob, believing he had been a bad influence on Anna and wasn't deserving of the family's wealth. Linda had always considered Jacob beneath them. It was an interesting lead, but still, there wasn't anything directly linking Linda to the crime. Harper kept his focus on Richard, but Linda's name stayed in the back of his mind. Could she have played a role in all this, or was Harper simply grasping at straws? A breakthrough came when Harper decided to re-examine the phone records and surveillance footage collected from the days surrounding Jacob's murder. Most of it had been thoroughly reviewed, but Harper was certain he had missed something. He combed through the logs of calls made on the day Jacob died, focusing particularly on Richard and Linda's movements. That's when he noticed something strange. Richard's phone had been inactive for several hours that morning, something Harper had already noted. But there was another phone call, a short, seemingly insignificant one, placed from Linda's phone to Richard's at around 9 a.m. on the day of Jacob's death. Harper wasn't sure what to make of it yet, but he flagged it in the back of his mind as potentially relevant. He then pulled up footage from a convenience store located a few miles from Lake Travis, a common stop for people traveling to and from the area. Harper had reviewed it once before, but nothing of significance had stood out at the time. However, as he watched again, something new caught his eye. At 8:45 a.m. on the morning of the murder, a black sedan resembling Linda's car was captured on the footage, driving in the direction of the lake. Harper felt a jolt of excitement. Linda's presence at the lake that morning hadn't been uncovered earlier. This was the first major piece of evidence that directly connected Linda to the scene, but Harper knew it wasn't enough by itself. He needed more to tie her to the murder. Harper decided to question the convenience store clerk again to confirm the sighting of the car. The clerk vaguely remembered the vehicle but couldn't be certain it was Linda's. Still, it was enough for Harper to dig further into Linda's activities that day. Harper couldn't stop thinking about Linda's calculated demeanor and how, throughout the investigation, she had remained in the shadows, seemingly innocent. But now, her hatred for Jacob and her potential proximity to the crime scene were raising serious questions. What if Linda, not Richard, had been the one to act on her rage? Harper's mind spun as he pieced together the possibility. Linda might have discovered the affair between Jacob and her husband and taken matters into her own hands. Harper returned to his desk with renewed determination. He ordered another round of checks on Linda's whereabouts and re-interviewed people who had seen her in the days leading up to the murder. Some recalled her seeming more stressed than usual, but it wasn't enough to build a solid case. Then, another key piece of the puzzle fell into place. Harper's team found additional footage from a nearby gas station, where Linda had stopped on the morning of the murder. The timestamp confirmed that it was Linda's car, and this time, Harper had proof that she had been near Lake Travis that morning. The footage wasn't just a coincidence anymore, it placed her near the scene at a crucial time. Harper felt the weight of the discovery settle on him. He had been so focused on Richard and his affair with Jacob that he had overlooked the one person who may have had even more reason to hate Jacob, Linda. Her anger toward Jacob, her desire to protect the family's image, and the newly discovered evidence linking her to the area on the day of the murder were painting a far more sinister picture. It wasn't long before Harper shifted his investigation to focus heavily on Linda. She had slipped under the radar until now, but everything was starting to fall into place. The facade of the grieving wife and mother was starting to crack. Harper now believed that Linda had discovered the affair and, in a desperate bid to keep the scandal from ruining the family, had decided to eliminate Jacob once and for all. As Harper prepared to confront Linda with the evidence, he couldn't help but marvel at how easily she had hidden in plain sight. All this time, the focus had been on Richard, but it was becoming clear that Linda may have been the mastermind behind the murder. By the time Detective Harper sat down to review the convenience store footage in detail, the case had hit a dead end. Richard had denied everything, and without any physical evidence tying him to the crime, Harper felt the pressure mounting. That all changed when the surveillance footage was fully analyzed. The grainy video showed Linda, alone in her black sedan, driving toward Lake Travis on the morning of Jacob's murder. The timestamp matched the window during which Jacob was killed. It was the first concrete evidence placing Linda at the scene. Harper felt a sense of vindication. His gut had told him that Richard wasn't the true murderer, despite his affair with Jacob. Now, the focus shifted to Linda. He had to move quickly before she realized the investigation was closing in on her. Harper immediately ordered an analysis of phone records from the morning of Jacob's death, hoping for more evidence to strengthen the case. The records didn't disappoint. Linda had called Jacob that morning, just before his murder. Harper could piece together the narrative. Linda had likely lured Jacob to Lake Travis under some pretense, perhaps asking for a private conversation. She wanted to make sure no one else was around. The affair between Jacob and Richard had left her feeling humiliated, and in a town as small as Lakeway, just outside Austin, scandal spread like wildfire. Linda had everything to lose if the truth came out: her reputation, her standing in the community, and her carefully curated life. The motive was clear now. Linda wasn't acting out of jealousy or love, but out of pure self-preservation. She saw Jacob as a threat to her family's public image and a symbol of her husband's betrayal. To her, killing Jacob would not only erase that threat but also keep the scandal contained. Harper began reaching out to more of Linda's acquaintances, digging into her behavior in the weeks leading up to the murder. Several people had noticed her growing cold toward Jacob, but no one had thought much of it at the time. Linda had always been poised and composed, and her ability to maintain that facade had kept her from suspicion, until now. As Harper prepared to confront Linda, he knew he had enough to press her hard. The footage, the phone records, and the testimonies of those who had noticed her changing demeanor painted a clear picture. When Harper finally sat across from Linda in the interview room, her calm demeanor began to crack under the weight of the evidence. Harper showed her the footage of her car near Lake Travis, explained the phone records, and mentioned the witnesses who had noticed her growing animosity toward Jacob. Linda sat in silence for what felt like hours, her expression frozen. Finally, she broke. Linda admitted that she had lured Jacob to the lake that morning. She had asked to speak to him privately, pretending that she wanted to discuss the family. But as they stood by the water, Linda had confronted him about the affair with her husband. In a desperate attempt to protect her family's reputation and to rid herself of Jacob's presence once and for all, she stabbed him in the chest. She thought it would be quick, but Jacob had stumbled backward, bleeding out by the edge of the lake. Linda panicked and fled the scene, hoping to make it look like a tragic accident. Linda's confession shocked everyone. Harper hadn't expected her to give in so easily, but the weight of her guilt had finally caught up with her. Once she started talking, it all came pouring out. Linda explained that she had felt trapped. She couldn't divorce Richard or expose his affair with Jacob without destroying her family, but she also couldn't live with the constant humiliation. In the end, murder had seemed like her only option. Harper arrested Linda on the spot, charging her with first-degree murder. The trial began in early 2019 at the Travis County Courthouse in downtown Austin. The media coverage was intense, with reporters flocking to the courthouse, eager for any details. Inside the courtroom, Linda appeared a shadow of her former self, her once perfect image shattered. The prosecution presented a clear case. Linda had discovered the affair between her husband and her son-in-law, and in a desperate attempt to preserve her life and reputation, she had killed Jacob. The defense tried to argue that Linda had acted out of extreme emotional distress, but the evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, phone records, and Linda's own confession left little room for doubt. Richard attended every day of the trial, his face drawn and pale. He had not known about Linda's plan to kill Jacob, but the guilt weighed heavily on him. Anna, too, was present every day, torn between her love for her parents and the unbearable betrayal she felt. Her world had crumbled. The trial ended swiftly, and the jury deliberated for less than a day. Linda was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, and Linda showed no emotion as she was led away in handcuffs. In the aftermath, the family struggled to pick up the pieces. Richard sold the family home and moved out of Austin. He rarely spoke to anyone from his old life and lived in seclusion. Anna moved away with her child, determined to start a new life far from the dark shadow her parents' actions had cast over her family. She remarried a few years later, trying to build something new out of the wreckage. Detective Harper moved on to other cases, but the murder of Jacob would stay with him. It wasn't just the complexity of the investigation or the shocking confession. It was the reminder that even the most seemingly perfect lives could unravel in ways no one ever expected. And thus ended the dark and twisted tale of betrayal, scandal, and murder that had once been hidden behind the facade of a perfect family in a small Texas town.